Exciting! Neo Geo! Max 330メガの劇的体験 Neo Geo System SNK.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to Video Game Esoterica and our continuing series, Neo Nostalgia, where usually I look at some of my favorite Neo Geo games of all time, but today we're actually doing some mod work because I've had this Neo Geo Arcade Stick Pro sitting in the box for about 6 months because I got it on sale for $80 on Amazon. Seems like they're trying to clear these things out. And while I have absolutely no interest in playing the Neo Geo games in the stick, I do have a lot of interest in using the stick for some modification processes. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like, subscribe, that notification bell definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. But the Neo Geo Arcade Stick Pro is a great enclosure. I love the shape, I love the weight of it, but there's two things I don't like about it. The fundamental things, the stick and the buttons. These are not arcade quality parts. They're decently close, but they're not good enough for me. So what I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to be putting a Sanwa stick and Seimitsu buttons into the enclosure so I can have this be as close to arcade perfect as I can get it. Because these buttons here are dull, they're mushy, and I just don't like them. So I'm going to be harvesting that Sanwa stick and the Seimitsu buttons out of a really janky arcade stick I built a while ago out of a cigar box. It's just a prototype to something I wanted to do a final design on, and it was a mock-up to see how things would sit in there. If you take a look at the back of the Neo Geo Arcade Stick Pro, there are a bunch of screws, and I'm pointing them out right now, including this little rubber one on the bottom of it. It looks like it's different than everything else, but it is not. You have a port for the ball top to remove it, and there is one screw underneath the USB compartment right here. So if you're taking this apart, definitely take that door out and make sure you have that screw removed as well. I usually like to use, at least for half of the process here, the foam inserts that came with the stick, because you can't just turn it upside down with the ball top and the shaft sitting right there, or else it wiggles around on your table. For camera work, this makes it a lot easier. Do be careful when you're removing the rubber pads. You have some options, but you don't want to scratch the plastic. You've got that plastic scrudger that just decided to run away, and you can use a metal tool as well. These are in pretty much any, hardware repair kit you will get. I love this little plastic tip here because it allows me to get underneath that rubber foot and remove those covers. I've heard that this is a pain in the butt to do. With this tool, it takes about 2 to 3 seconds per little rubber cap, so just use something like this and you should be totally fine. But do remember that you can't just take the ball top off of the stick because it is free spinning and it's locked in there. But if you turn the stick upside down, there is this little cover right here that allows you to put a flathead screwdriver into the bottom of the arcade stick shaft so that you can lock the stick from the inside and go ahead and turn the ball from the top of it. It's a little fiddly, you kinda gotta do it blind, but if you get it correct, it's not that hard. Those 3 parts will just fall to the bottom, and that's what we need. Because if that ball top is still on the stick, you're not going to be able to separate the two halves because that ball will get stuck in that little hole right there. But now that we have that removed, we can proceed to getting into the arcade stick in and of itself, because that's where we're going to be working. And you will remove all of these screws underneath all of the rubber caps that we just talked about removing. And be careful when you pull this up. It's not the hardest thing in the world, but it is plastic. If you snap something, you're going to have a hard time getting it back together, or it's going to be completely impossible. So don't go crazy. If it's not coming off easy, something's catching, go back and redo your work, but make sure you keep that USB cable through and you'll be into the internals. So what we have here is the stick, and it is made out of mostly plastic parts that have a lot of play. I just don't like it, and the buttons, like I said, are just a little bit mushy and damp, but luckily they are 3mm buttons and they have quick disconnects, so it's not too much of a pain to deal with this. That is the great thing. You should be able to just pinch it with your hand. There's a little tab around the middle that locks into the inside, so you can't just pull straight up, and never pull from the wire, always pull from the connector. Just give it a little pinch, a little wiggle, and it should pop right out with just a little bit of effort. If you're pulling really hard, that means that it's not disconnected on that little nipple in there, so try again. If it is giving you a whole lot of hell, and this one did, just use a pair of pliers, pinch that nipple, and make sure you pull up from the metal connector. It will work fine. Now these are push-in buttons, so on each side there is a tab that locks into the plastic. Use a flathead screwdriver that fits into the recess, push them in ever so slightly and apply downward pressure. It doesn't need to be too much. You'll see here I'm doing this on camera and I'm barely even articulating that screwdriver. go slow. You don't want to break the plastic, you don't want to damage it. But once it's loose, that button will fall right out and it'll be in your hand, and now we can get rid of that mushy plastic nonsense. I chose to use screw-in buttons because that's what I had, but I will say the design of the plastic molding is quite intelligent because the screw-in buttons fit perfect. Just go ahead and apply both of those quick disconnects back to the posts on the button. It is signal agnostic. You don't need to know what's ground and what's signal. Just do one button at a time, that way you can't get the wiring mixed up and you will be 100%. There is no ground and 5 volt. It is either or on there. And you'll see here that I got all 6 buttons installed correctly. Just be careful on this one button here. It's very close to the ribbon cable for the PCB itself, so don't damage that when you're working around it. Try to push it out of the way, but if you did everything correctly, we now have those 6 buttons in. I was going to do 8. I thought I had 2 more of these. I'll replace the 2 rightmost buttons at a certain point in time when I order some more stuff. But let's move on to removing the stick from the enclosure, because that's as bad as the buttons, and it's held on to the plastic with these 4 screws right here. And you can lift it up, or you can disconnect the quick disconnects from the stick as well. Maybe you want to reuse this. I don't. I'm showing you how to remove it non-destructively on camera, but if I was doing this for myself, I just would have cut these wires and moved on about my day. And you'll see we have 4 colors for the 4 cardinal directions: north, south, east, west, up, down, left, and right. And then there is a ground chain with all of the colors. Really not sure why they didn't just use black. That's the color of ground, but they decided to use all the colors. But you'll see that big mess of rainbow wires. That is your ground chain, a very important signal. Without that, nothing is going to work. Now, dropping the Sanwa stick in, and I'll leave the model number down below so you see. I recommend leaving the harness to the inside, not the outside, because there's not enough material there. And you're going to use an M4 machine screw, 10mm depth, into those 4 screw bosses. Do not screw them in too hard. If it's not going, it's stripping something out. If you break that plastic screw boss, the stick's never going to stay in again. You've ruined the enclosure, so just be careful. Now on Sanwa, black is ground, and they use 22 AWG gauge wire, so I'll just use a pair of wire strippers and I'll take some of the insulation off of that wire. Now I leave too much wire in my installation method here that I have to tuck away, but I do that intentionally because I may take the stick out of this in 6 months and use it for something different, so I leave as much material behind as I want to. You don't have to. I'll then cut off the quick disconnect to the ground chain. That's going to be 28 AWG, at least in this revision of the stick. Not sure if they changed the wiring ever, but 28 should be fine. Sometimes it takes a little pressure to get through that insulation, but just go ahead and pull, and now we have both of our wires exposed. And what we're going to do is we're going to put these 2 wires together. I put a piece of heat shrink tubing insulation around the edges, and then you could do a lineman splice on this, but honestly it's not under really any tension. So go ahead and just twist those wires together. Now my tutorial is going to involve soldering, but I'm pretty sure because this stick doesn't get wiggled too hard, if you don't know how to solder, you should get away with just basically splicing those cables together with a twist. Your mileage may vary. I'm 100% going to solder them, and you don't need much solder. Now don't critique my method on how to solder here, because I'm standing underneath the camera looking up at the sky at an LCD flip out screen and holding my arms in the air to keep my hands off camera. But just paint a little solder on until it is fused together. If you have a glob, just go ahead and wipe it off and you're totally fine. You will then just push that heat shrink tube insulation over that splice that you had right there, and because I lost my lighter, I'm using a match, but go ahead and apply heat to it until that tube starts shrinking around the wire. That way we know it's insulated and it can't ground out to anything else in the case. Always insulate your splices. It's rule of thumb. You definitely want to do it. And you're going to do the exact same thing with left, right, up, and down. I will leave the pinouts to the Sanwa stick as well as the Neo Geo Arcade Stick Pro below. I'm not going to show you splicing 4 more wires because you've seen it once. Just go ahead and do it to the correct pinout, and honestly, if you make a mistake, you'll know immediately and you just go back in and redo your work. Cable management's a little hard. Just make sure you're not putting those cables over the screw bosses or holes. I tuck everything up in the top right hand corner. And the last thing you need to do is put the cover as well as the shaft stick over, and I am replacing this with my Sanwa ball top. The shaft cover is slightly too short to be able to fully cover. Makes no mechanical difference whatsoever functionally at all. It's a little aesthetically displeasing, but what am I going to do here? But the stick feels great. What I do as well is I go into MAME, just load up a game, and I use their key assignments to make sure everything is exactly as it should be. You can do this with a gamepad tester. I've just always used MAME, and I will use the stick in the directions it should be working to assign those directions. Up, down, left, and right. Everything is working good here, and I just assign some nonsense to all the buttons to make sure every button is registering as the button it should when hooked up to a Windows PC. This will also work on a Steam Deck. I believe it works on an Xbox Series X. It's not going to work on anything like a PlayStation 5 at this point in time. But once you know you have all your buttons working correctly and all your directions working correctly, you can just go ahead and play a game. And it feels so much better than using these stock parts in the Neo Geo Arcade Stick Pro. They're not the worst parts I've ever felt, but the arcade stick itself is made out of mostly plastic, and it has a ton of play, and those buttons just feel mushy and dead, and I absolutely do not like that. But the stick as it is now feels absolutely spectacular. I like the style of the enclosure, and it works well for me. Outside of taking that death, not the stick's fault, I just wasn't paying attention. And just don't forget to put the rubber feet on the bottom so it doesn't slide around as well. But short of that, flip it right side up and you have yourself a brand new arcade stick. Awesome enclosure, brand new buttons and stick. If you want to do this mod and you have any questions, leave them down below. I'd say it's like a 5 out of 10 difficulty, 7 out of 10 for working space. But yeah, it's great and I'll be using it for a long time. See you guys next time. Bye bye.